So welcome everyone to this ePortfolios panel, the second session of the morning, running directly after that really thought-provoking start that we've had with the ethical framework. So I'm Claire Thompson and I'm a digital education consultant at Ulster University and the co-chair of the Northern Ireland ALT members group. And I'm really interested in this morning, coming from a CMALT holder and assessor, as well as my PhD work in medical education reflective practice. So I'm hoping for some really good discussion around ePortfolios this morning with Shane and Teresa and Paolo. So what we're going to do is really have some prompt questions at the beginning, and then take whatever your questions come through in the chat. So essentially, this session was kind of individual sessions, and it's come together in this panel. So we're going to try and marry together conversation, but also getting behind the really interesting projects that each of the three speakers have been working on. So keep the chat going. We will pause after each prompt question to kind of review what's going on, and then at the end we'll be able to kind of open it up to the floor to everybody. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Shane.
Good morning, everybody. You can see what I do. I've been doing it for quite a while now. In fact, if you've got my video, I'd just like to say that when I started thinking about ePortfolios, I had dark brown hair. I was probably about 2 stone lighter and maybe even an inch taller. That's all you need to know right now, I think.
Okay, and I'll move on to Teresa.
Hi, yeah, so I did a little blog post because I have been doing work with ePortfolios for a little while, and I thought it would be easier to give people a chance to digest that rather than throwing too much out at you. Currently, I'm not tweeting as at Warwick Language because I've lost access to Twitter, so I'm tweeting as Eurocall at the moment. However, yeah, I'm looking forward to having this opportunity, and I think it follows on really nicely actually from the ethical discussions we were having in the first session.
And Paolo.
Hi everyone, yeah, I'm Paolo Prandi. I'm a senior learning technologist at the University of Sussex. I'm a doctor of education and I'm an member and chair of the Active Learning Network. And currently I'm involved in researching the use of portfolios in my institution at Sussex, hoping to attract more adoption and, you know, looking for ways that we can support it. Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk much more in a little bit.
Okay, so without further ado, then we will jump straight into the first prompt question. And once we start into the questions, I will stop sharing the slides because I think it did work really nicely this morning where everybody got to see each other. So open to all three panelists, what does an ePortfolio mean to you?
Go ahead, Shane.
I'm not quite sure what order we're going in. I mean, I think, as you said, Teresa, that it's, we really ought to make a link back to this morning's panel, which was excellent. We thought about portfolios for a long time as a safe space to learn. And I guess I wanted to say something about ePortfolio itself being a slippery concept, because when you think about a safe space to learn, I'm thinking about a place where you can go and reflect on your learning, plan for learning, record some of your anxieties. As my great friend Julie Hughes used to say, think through your fingertips in the space. But when we think about portfolios in that context, we're really thinking of them, I think, as a platform or a collection of tools, which is different to a portfolio as a presentation. because all of those things you should be able to do and come to understand your own learning. And it's only then that you take certain bits of them and maybe bring them together into a digital presentation that tells a particular story to a particular audience. And I'm reminded of my first ever portfolio definition was about 200 words long, but it ended with a digital theatre where the audience is by invitation only. And so I think that idea of the story, the digital story, purposefully told to an audience is really important. And of course, we have multiple stories. We don't have one all-encompassing story. And there's a third version of ePortfolio, I think. If people are familiar with Tracy Pennylight or Helen Chen, who talk about ePortfolio thinking, and I suppose, you know, borrowing from Helen Barrett and others, a place to collect, reflect, select, reject, and decide whether to project some of that stuff. And it doesn't matter if you have a platform or you build a portfolio. That way of being, that kind of pedagogical approach, I think is really important. So I guess, yeah, portfolio is a digital story, saying something about the learner and or things they've done. But that then calls into question, what about a Facebook site or a personal website or a LinkedIn profile? And indeed, some things that are called ePortfolios I don't think are very ePortfolio-like. So you need to, in a way, apply some criteria. And one of the ones we use a little framework called DAPA. DAPA stands for developmental. So does the portfolio, does this thing demonstrate the development of the author and or their learning over time or across context? Is it authentic? Is it personal? Is it purposeful? Again, not just a huge all-encompassing story, but actually is telling a very particular story to your audience. Is it evidenced and appropriately evidenced? And the R would be for reflective, because of course that's, I think, one thing we'd all agree upon, that portfolios really ought to be, they should indicate a connection between the learner, their learning, and the evidence that's brought to bear in the portfolio itself. So for me, to summarise, a portfolio is a story. We have lots of them, and if it fulfills some of those DAPA criteria, it's probably more ePortfolio-like than some other things might be. There's my starter for 10.
It's a great starter, and I'm going to follow it up by saying amen to most of that. So what does ePortfolio mean to me? Well, it's the provision of a tool or set of tools that provide a personal and private space online for both curation and reflecting. And I think that privacy element is particularly important to me. It's also a tool to support the exploration of online creativity and identity creation. And this is particularly for me working in a discipline which is focused on communication and intercultural communication as well. An opportunity for people to learn how to do that and to think about how they project themselves as they connect with different cultures. And also as a tool or set of tools, and obviously I'm coming at it from my experience of a particular ePortfolio set of tools, but that doesn't mean that I couldn't have done exactly the same thing in a different one. But that's where my experience lies. It is an opportunity to connect people both institutionally and beyond the institution, and also to give opportunities to co-create. So pretty powerful pedagogies behind an ePortfolio tool. And I think the vital bit that actually Shane was pointing to was the importance of when you use an ePortfolio for a particular audience or a particular tool, a particular purpose, you have the time to develop a construct behind its use. So that's particularly been my area of exploration, if you like, over the past 10 years or so with ePortfolios.
Thank you. Yeah, well, that is Well, my first sort of answer to this was that wasn't an easy question, but we've had some amazing answers. One of the reasons I thought it wasn't an easy question was because as I don't know if I mentioned when I introduced myself, but we are setting up a questionnaire for our members of staff at Sussex about how they're using portfolios and how we can support their use, and how can we and if they're not using them, how we can support more adoption. And one of the first questions is, well, what is a portfolio for you? And of course, we've had many different responses. We have an assessment mode called portfolio. And then people are sort of saying how they're using it, and obviously I think for most of us, we think of an art portfolio when we think of a portfolio, but in the e-portfolio space, we think quite a lot of a learning journal. And many people are using it, of course, as a collection of submissions of different types or the same types. So some people are using it literally just for collating practical results and write-ups. So they were using, so that was a portfolio of practicals. But other people, of course, using it for short essays, peer reviews, presentations, all submitted to the portfolio place. So I think I have to say I really liked the responses. I like the idea of a safe space to learn. I like the idea of a private space for creating and being creative that both Teresa and Shane mentioned. So, I mean, it is perhaps something that we will be addressing at Sussex, sort of saying, well, maybe starting with this, what an e-portfolio can be, and lining out some of the things mentioned already today.
Thank you for that, each of you. So what we'll do is we'll just take a couple of the questions that have come in. So the first one is that the difference between the student-owned and others where tutors have a lot more management permissions. So Shane, I think that was directed at you. So.
Well, I see Teresa nodded, so I'm sure she has a view on this too. But I think there's a bit of a myth about portfolios being personal and private and great spaces for creation, which is going to sound odd, perhaps coming from me. But the reality is, in most contexts, portfolios are written specifically for others, whether it's a professional body or a certificating authority or your institution. And it's the audience actually that determines what goes into your portfolio and the format that it takes. And I think that's also the difference between having somewhere where you can go and safely, privately make sense of your learning and make connections, and then the making visible particular stories to particular audiences. I mean, we work obviously with universities in the main, and most universities aren't buying portfolios or if not buying, implementing other good solutions just to help students personally reflect. There's always an element of that reflection being made visible to somebody. In most cases, I have to say, for assessment purposes, sometimes for things like personal tutorials and other forms of mentoring and that kind of thing. But I think the audience has a really important role to play in portfolios, less so in the personal space where the original reflections and recordings and making sense is kind of happening.
Yeah, I think Shane makes a really good point about the myth of privacy, and that's something that we all have to be aware of, because if we're asking anybody, student, learner, fellow practitioner or whatever, to do anything remotely, then that data is being collected, and we have to go into that with our eyes open. I think in my discussions, particularly in the portfolio for assessment that we have delivered, is that, and I'll just give you a link in the chat there for an e-portfolio assessment ebook actually that Lisa Donaldson helped pull together, is that it's actually very important to make a distinction perhaps between what I describe as the collection pot, your access to the infrastructure of an e-portfolio. So the fact that your institution, as in the case of my experience, it was a case of having a Mahoodle, so a Mahara that included a Mahara that was linked to our Moodle. It was a case of having a sort of yin and yang, a space that you could move from the VLE into a private area, and that would be your pot. That would be where you would collect things that you would want to come back to and think about later. So whether it's forum posts or a collection of interactions you've had in the VLE, or maybe feedback from a tutor, things that you can take away and put in your pot. And then the way that our assessment construct works, where we're getting students to think about how they then put together the showcase for their learning journey in languages, they're using that pot to evidence the thoughts that they've had and to evidence the skills. So that's the perhaps more public facing, depending on whether the students have, you know, got to the point where they're ready to make any portfolio for sharing. And that's where I think Shane and I totally agree that this is about the process. This is about foregrounding the process of learning, and helping students to take control of that. And in my experience, in a very kind of practical way as well, thinking about rights management, thinking about permissions. Who is this for? Who am I speaking to? What editorial decisions do I have around what I include in my e-portfolio? And the way I always explain it to our student tutees who are from lots of different disciplines, who are learning languages as a sort of an additional string to their bow, it's a way of getting them to recognize that there are lots of transversal skills that they're engaging with when they're perhaps learning Russian as a beginner. So, you know, maybe in their year of beginners Russian, they're not going to come out as a brilliant Russian interactor. There's still a long way to go, but they have acquired lots of great transversal skills in language and communication. And the e-portfolio process helps them to realize that. So yeah, that would be my take on that particular aspect, I think.
Okay, well, just before we move on to the next prompt, I think leading on from the permissions aspect you were just speaking of there, Aideen is asking about your thoughts on reflective portfolios being used in peer learning. So sort of a lot more formative feedback opportunity rather than that high stakes.
So I'll come in on that. I think there's a lot of opportunity for peer. Well, I think portfolios are personal space for collating thoughts, and you can kind of specialize, or depending obviously what you've been asked to do in the portfolio space, but there's an opportunity for personalizing your learning, I think, within the portfolio space. And I think that can give students an opportunity for work, for having not knowledge that is personal to themselves and not shared and not coming direct from the tutor. And that can give the opportunity for a natural peer engagement, a natural talking points between students, because they conceptualize the concepts of the subject at a personal level and have personal opinions on them. So I do think, although portfolios can be thought of as personal, I think they do actually open up a space for more peer engagement and peer learning, and that can be brought in to a teaching environment.
Does anyone want to follow up on that, or will we move on to the next question, do you think?
Yeah, I think we could move on, but it's down to that construct again. You know, e-portfolios are a very flexible tool. So it's all about having, you know, working through that construct.
And that probably takes us into the next question nicely then, because it is, what does good practice on e-portfolios look like for each of you?
Well, if we're going in the same order, I'm not sure. Shout me down if we're not. I mean, I think my answer ties into a lot of the questions which are happening in the chat at the moment, particularly around assessments, I think. I've seen some fantastic, what we would call about me portfolios, like personal, professional, promotional. You know, hey, look at me, look at all the clever things I've done, give me a job, give me a badge, promote me. and they're wonderful and often really, really insightful. But the portfolios that that fascinate me the most at the moment are what we would call task portfolios, ones which scaffold and support the process of kind of complex learning tasks and/or assessment over time. And what they do really well is surface the process of learning. And to give you some examples, the University of the Sunshine Coast, across a very large number of its courses, use Portfolio to support flipped classroom. So week by week, there are activities, the students undertake them, they reflect back in their portfolio, they make links between the various sessions week by week, and at the end of it, they've got a portfolio by one description or another of everything they learned across that course. And over multiple courses, they build a portfolio of portfolios. At Griffith University, in chemistry and physics, they use portfolios for their experiments. So they plan for their experiments. They think about what they're going to do, how to design the data collection as the experiment takes place. They record evidence, they take images or video and the data itself. They reflect on how well the experiment went. They again make links between other experiments. McMaster University in Ontario use portfolios for onboarding and orientation into new subject disciplines for their students. University of Birmingham, they have, I imagine Birmingham is probably when I say leading, probably the most prolific user of portfolios maybe in the UK at the moment. 39,000 active portfolio users, largely driven by the use of portfolios for personal tutorials. Really precious time between the student and the tutor, which is enhanced by the student thinking about what they want from their meeting, evidencing, thinking about connecting feedback and grades, sharing that with a tutor in advance, reflecting on the meeting afterwards. But perhaps my favourite is SLICS from the University of Edinburgh, student-led, individually created courses where they're using portfolios to scaffold undergraduate research, which means they've been able to really expand the amount of undergraduate research that's available, offer lots of independent study opportunities to students, and make that manageable because of the light touch supervision that takes place, because so much of the work is scaffolded within the portfolios itself. So all of these, I think, are really, really powerful uses of portfolio for learning, teaching, and assessment. And I think assessments are a really important driver of it, because the portfolio element allows assessment to be for as well as of learning, and multiple stakeholders can get involved as well. We asked about, we mentioned peer assessment, but of course external stakeholders as well, students working collaboratively. So I think we have to move on, and in fact most mature portfolio implementations have moved on from thinking about portfolios as enhanced resumes to be much more important curriculum devices that really support learning, teaching, and assessment.
Yeah, I'm going to say amen to all of that, Shane. I think it's really important. It's it's thinking about perhaps making that distinction between the portfolio as a platform and the implementation of an e-portfolio, either for assessment or for whatever the purpose or construct that we have. What I would say is from experience that it takes a while to really engage students in exploring the various potentials, if you like, of using an e-portfolio. And often we kind of think, okay, well, we just plug this in, make it available, and it will become self-evident. Well, it really doesn't. You have to build a community within your e-portfolio. So one of the things that we've done in all the implementations, and I totally accept that often assessment is the driver that pushes us there. So when we had a 20% assessment for the language e-portfolio, the starting point was to create a group, a community, a space. So this is where people could access help. It's where the video tutorials were. It's where the documentation sat. So you actually then gave students time to explore the space. And I used to very openly encourage them to, why don't you make a page for the society you're running, or why don't you make a page to show this particular element of your academic career that you want to showcase. So there are lots of good reasons, but you need to be in there in the first place, and that takes a good deal of time and effort. So it really isn't a case of, putting a solution in place. Yeah, these are wonderful. It's a case of, like everything, it ain't what you do, it's how you do it. And I have found, I actually 100% assessed through ePortfolio on the final year language students who wished to become teachers. And the feedback I had from those students was, at first it seemed, why were you taking us to this other space? We already have to go to Moodle. Why do we have to go to somewhere else? And then when they realised that actually their virtual exchange was mediated through it, their ability to manage their own profiles was being developed through it by keeping a journal and thinking every week. And that involved quite a lot of trust, because I couldn't see what journal entries they were making until they decided to show them to me. So there's kind of a relationship that it can mediate as well between the learner and the practitioner, as well as between learner and learner. So yeah, great examples. And the limit, I think, is your imagination, your creativity, but you have to be familiar with the platform, and that does take time.
Yeah, I agree with all the points, of course, and I think the idea I think that Shane started with was sort of consistent engagement through a module as well, because in many modules, week by week, some of it won't be relevant to what you're finally assessed on, particularly if it's essay based. A portfolio gives the opportunity to be assessed, and the students' work and contributions to each part of the module to be recognised, and and perhaps flexibly, perhaps they don't have to necessarily bring in every week, or perhaps you expect them to. I think so. We kind of, I think the interesting thing about portfolios and degrees, because I think I'm talking about degrees and higher education, is I was talking to a colleague earlier, and while we're doing the 18 modules that make up our degree, we're also constructing a portfolio of learning over that time. What I'm currently interested in my institution is the portfolios we create at the module level, but that would naturally, hopefully, build the students' understanding that they're also building portfolios throughout, just by doing multiple modules. So I think I am interested in portfolios that are directed, in terms of the tutor should give direction to the student about what they're expected to submit to them eventually, but that perhaps flexibility is important as well. Perhaps the final submission of portfolio, you haven't told them exactly what they need to submit. If there will be an element of choice, there will be an expectation that perhaps, and I certainly agree, the reflective components is very important and sometimes missing out in students' education, but expecting some reflection on learning, because how we learn is certainly a transferable skill that we take outside of the university. We expect some criticality. We expect some evidence of communicating, and perhaps a portfolio is one way of communicating, but there might be multiple ways that you're communicating your knowledge. So I'm very interested. So in some courses, people are learning a whole load of theories, a whole load of practice, and their final assessment is an essay. But maybe they can't write an essay well, but they have understood many of the concepts, and they can choose how they express that by other ways. And I think the portfolio format allows that flexibility. Also, a research component would be included within a portfolio as well. But I think also there's a question about feedback over the term, feedback to the students, potentially from the tutors, if the tutor has time and not too many students, feedback from peers, but also feedback to the tutor, even if they're just glancing very quickly over the portfolios that have been submitted, in order to adapt their teaching according to what they're finding their students are either interested in or understanding or misunderstanding. Yeah. So I think, I don't know if that's a good, yeah, so yeah, and that's kind of what I think. I don't know if that sums it up, what is good practice in portfolio teaching, but
Perfect. Thank you all. So just looking back through, making sure I haven't skipped any of the questions, just to go back to one that Lucy Ann had posted. Interested in your view on portfolios being private. So again, this kind of pull between the private and the public. And what is the experience of students wanting to take their portfolios in their new professional lives as a demonstration of those skills and abilities that they've built up during their time at university?
Well, if I can jump in, this is one of the things that really worried me when I got engaged with ePortfolios, because if you're asking people to demonstrate their learning and to do it for a specific purpose, and they really do engage with it and they enjoy it, how do they then, you know, once they lose access to the university systems, continue that? And how, you know, how are they able to do that? And for me, because I'm approaching retirement, that's become particularly important. So the experience that I have with Mahara has meant that I've been able to, because it's an open source tool, I've been able to use the Leap 2 format and remove all my content from the institutional repository and take it to Folio Spaces, which is a free host. So that has been very important, and it's been something that I've communicated to the students so that they can pick this up and carry it on. And I think, you know, if we're asking for that degree of investment, it's also a real opportunity to mediate that discussion with people about who has ownership of my thoughts. Who has ownership of the intellectual investment that we make in the learning process? Who has the right to own that? And I would contend that actually only the person thinking the thoughts has the right to take that with them and to share it as or where they wish to. And I think that's important when you're thinking about research as well. If research is part of your development and part of your career path, then, you know, absolutely it's important to know what belongs to you and then what is surrendered to an institution that you then lose access to at a particular point.
For me, I mean, I'd agree with Teresa, at least largely. I mean, I think every institution looking at portfolios, that should be the very first question. Do students get to keep their stuff? Does it belong to them? And I think it does, but actually it's not quite that simple, because some of the stuff is co-owned, because some of it has to be shared with the institution. There's a contract between the student and the institution. They hand over some things which are then assessed and a grade is given for those things, and the university has to retain access to those. But all they have is access to them. They still belong to the learner. When the learner goes, they take them with them. And in fact, my original proposal for this session talked about, in effect, teacher education in Wales, where from university, when students are teachers, they start off in a university tool and then they move their work with them into the profession, and they carry on thinking about their professional development, very rooted in a reflective practice right the way through their entire careers. We see that happening in lots of other places too. So ownership is really important, but it's not as straightforward as it just belongs to the user. Sometimes there's a co-ownership model because it's part of a contract with the institution. The other thing about that privacy bit, it's really interesting because, again, we have to separate out the idea of where reflection is taking place, the sort of collection of all of this stuff, and the presentations that I make. And certainly I should have control over when to rescind access to the presentations I make, unless it's part of a very structured formal assessment process with the university, where I enter into a contract, if you like, with the university. But I don't need to have a portfolio to reflect. If I've used portfolios really well, if the institution has guided me in the kind of ways of being and thinking and making links and connections, I don't have to have that framework once I leave. Absolutely keep my stuff. But as we're sitting here, I'm writing into my notebook things, and I use Evernote extensively for my reflections. I used my portfolio for my CMALT application. So, and I think when you leave university, because there's something else around portfolios, and I'm surprised it hasn't come up here actually, in most portfolio conferences I go to, there's a sort of shaming exercise that goes on where the audience are asked to put their hands up if they have a portfolio. But unless you need a portfolio, why would you have one? It doesn't mean you're not a reflector or you don't think about your learning or plan for your learning. Portfolios always need an audience, or normally always need an audience. And if you don't have an audience at any particular time, then why are you creating a portfolio? Because a portfolio should have an audience in mind and should be a purposeful story you're telling to that audience. So please, yeah, go ahead and reflect and make sense of your learning and make connections and share it with other people and get their input on it. But you don't have to have a portfolio for that to happen. Hopefully you use portfolios a lot. Like Paolo was saying, through all your modules on your course, and you're inculcated into this way of this ePortfolio way of thinking. But the actual production side is only important when there's an audience that wants to see something, I think. And the very act of creating a portfolio for a particular audience is in itself a learning opportunity, and shouldn't be squandered by just throwing everything into an electronic domain. I hope that made some sense. I may have tried to say too much in one go.
No, I think it does make sense. I'm not sure if I'm still answering the question, but sort of following on, I think we all have portfolios, whether we know it or not, or we've constructed it or not, because we've all got lots of areas of work, areas of learning, whatever you want to call it, which we could, I mean, ideally we'd package it all in one place. So finally, after my many different streams of education, I sort of have all the essays I've still got and you know, my theses and stuff like that in one place, and my papers, and then you package and show it. And I don't know if this is, I think the portfolio is my personal sort of history of learning or construction or work, and then I show different parts of it to different audiences. So we all keep a portfolio in some sense. It's how organised we are, and obviously an e-portfolio potentially helps us to organise it better. Certainly, I think portability for any e-portfolio providers is extremely important. Be able to take it out. So you know, if the content is stuck in your portfolio, that's not as helpful as if it was easily portable and yeah, taken to something that can be used outside of the educational institution properly.
And I think all of those answers actually then go in some way to answer the question, how can students be encouraged or motivated to consistently use personal portfolios? So I think those personal themes are really important there, aren't they?
I think,
yeah, it's like how do you encourage students to do anything consistently? How do you encourage any of us human beings to do anything consistently? And I think it leads into our third question. Actually, I think that's a question that certainly comes into my answer of the enablers, and so our final question that we've planned here. So maybe we could deal with it in that category.
Yeah, so I'm just checking back. There was just one quick one before we move on about the links between micro-credentials and badging. So if we have a very quick round up for that, and then we'll move on to our last prompt.
that sounds like a session all in its own right.
Yeah, it does. It's quite a big one. I have put a little bit in my blog post about micro-credentials because I've done quite a bit of work in that area. What mattered to me really was that because I work in virtual exchange with students, is collecting evidence of activities that they've taken part in that are as yet not really recognised, that are still innovative and new, that creating micro-credentials around those and having the opportunity to showcase them and to demonstrate them almost as shortcuts for, you know, yes, I've really participated in this and done it. That potentiality was particularly important to me. So you'll see that in my blog post. There is a link around that. So that if you've got open badges awarded that you have within your backpack or whatever, wherever you're storing them, if you choose to issue them, to show them publicly, they're easily incorporated in an e-portfolio. And all badges, Debs.
Okay, now so we are heading into our last 10 minutes. So there's, as we knew, the problem was going to be time. There's so much to cover and so much to get into. But our last prompt was, what are the enablers and barriers to use of e-portfolios? So will we reverse it this time? And Paolo, you kick off on this one?
Sure. I don't have an easy answer to it. I mean, I don't know. I've got a whole load of notes. You can have a look at my notes. I think there's I mean, this is so obvious, really, and you know, you guys have all been thinking about this so hard already. But I mean, obviously, there's a culture in education generally of essays and exams, and you know, the major barrier is changing that culture. So I often say in many different contexts, sometimes you can convince an academic to use a portfolio, which is, I'm obviously a massive advocate of this as a teaching and learning and assessment technique. But some of the biggest, the barriers are actually the students. They're the major barriers for innovation sometimes, because they have certainly if they're not a first year student, they have expectations of what education's about and how they'll be assessed. And if the portfolio is too different to what they're expecting, they themselves can be a barrier, despite the massive potential of portfolio for themselves for I think the better learning experience and fairer assessment as well that you're going to get. There are obvious barriers, like how do you grade it fairly? You know, it's not as easy as grading an examination where the rest yes, no answers, depending, obviously. I mean, you could have an examination as part of your portfolio that you could optionally submit. So that might be one model that I would recommend, in fact. If you're expecting to give each of your students feedback through the module, and you've got a massive cohort, or if you've got a small cohort, you may not have time to give that feedback to each one of them, or to even change your teaching because of what you're reading, if you have to change it. So there are also disciplinary expectations within, in the science, is if something was too reflective, perhaps some people wouldn't value that as good teaching practice. So there's a whole massive shift in. I think the argument is largely one in terms of learning, especially about people interested in pedagogy. But for many academics, what is learning, how they should teach, and how they should assess, they will do what they've done before. So these are, I'm sure we've all talked about this sort of stuff before in the past. So so it's sort of like getting, well, what would be useful for your students in the future? We've talked a bit, so part of this about doing it, having the portfolios at the module level and things, and getting students to do it consistently, that question there, is by setting these, having portfolios in your teaching and the expectations for assessment, you hopefully showing them by example why it's useful, and they'll continue to use that because that is what they find it valuable in their learning. So I'm taking up too much time, and I'll let someone else speak. Thanks.
I've got a quick just summary of thoughts based on the implementations that I've been involved in, and one of them goes straight back to something Shane said earlier, which is, in terms of enablers, what need are you addressing? If you haven't got a need to address, then why use an e-portfolio? So in order to make it a success, there must be an acknowledged understanding that this is something we ought to be doing. This is something that actually we need to address in some way. The second and third element of my response on enablers really is to do with management. So the first one is time. It actually takes time to develop assessment constructs, and often that time isn't considered part of workload models in terms of directed time. Well, when we developed the e-portfolio, the assessed e-portfolio for languages, there was a team of us, and it's been multiple members over a period of 10 years or so, but it took, and it's an international team of people all coming with their different cultural expectations of what assessment looks like. It took months of time working together to think about what our ePortfolio was going to look like, and that time is often just not factored into the process. But the 10 years that we've been working together have brought a much deeper and greater understanding, collaborative understanding of what we do in language assessment. So that time has, reaped huge rewards. So there would be a plea in there to allow practitioners to have the time to develop an assessment construct properly. And the second one is very much sort of connected to the success from a student perspective. And again, it comes down to, this one has the word time in it, just in time technical support. So, there's a tendency to want to implement anything new with a whole load of front-loaded information that students are supposed to just swallow and understand. And actually, I've found over the years that it's much more important to allow nuggets of information out as and when they're needed, hence the sort of help group that we usually set up every year for ePortfolio implementation, so that students can post on a forum and say, hey, how do I do X? And then we can learn from each other. So in terms of enablers, those would be my top tips. In terms of barriers, I think, it's really important that there is some personal ownership and also an exit strategy. We've kind of mentioned all of that on the route through what we're saying today, so I won't go into any more detail there. It's also so important to take people with you to communicate why we're doing this. Sometimes there's a failure to match the recognition in terms of what we're giving back to students or practitioners for engaging in ePortfolios, and to balance that against the investment that's required. There is a time and an intellectual investment required. Lots of discussions have to take place, and they're not the sort of things that you can always just do in a corridor. You need a bit of time. So there needs to be an acknowledgement further up the chain that actually says this is worth investing in, and therefore we will allow time for that to happen. So those would be my thoughts based on some years of experience in the area. Shane, you're going to top us off with something brilliant, I know.
I may have to talk really quickly.
In 2 minutes, Shane.
I completely agree with what Teresa said about time. And also there's a difference between like module level implementation and even course level implementation. I'm involved now with lots of enterprise level implementations and lots of institutions with tens of thousands of students portfolioing. And so we've developed over the years an implementation toolkit, and we run workshops. And one of the favorite workshops is Making It Fail, where we say to people, what are the things you're going to do to really undermine this implementation? I've run this lots of times. I collated all of the answers, and they always look like this: no vision, poor leadership, no time, layering it on top, rushing it. So there's the things to avoid. I mean, I think, as you said as well, Teresa, you've got to understand what the problem is you're trying to solve or what value you're trying to add to the process. And as we already talked about earlier in this session, I mean, and I'm not just saying this, I promise I'm not just saying this, but work with your learning technologists and your learning designers, because good learning design and good assessment design is so important. Otherwise, you've got all your existing work that teachers and students have to do, and then you layer this thing on top because someone else thinks portfolio is a great solution to some ill-defined problem. So understand what you're trying to achieve, understand what kind of value you're trying to bring, get the professionals involved, and allow some time. That collaboration piece you talked about as well, Teresa, is so important. And we could do a session on this. We could do a session on every single question that's been raised today.
It could run and run.
And we did, and we knew that was going to be the case. And we really, I think you managed to get so much in of your projects, of your background, of your expertise. So I really want to thank three of you for switching up your original thoughts on this session to the panel, because it really was rich. And I think if I had to choose one word for ePortfolios to take away, that's my word for that. It really is a rich experience for a practitioner or a student. And I think you really got that across. So thank you so much, all of you, and enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm here, and I'm sure the panelists will be here if people do want to stay a little bit longer, because there probably were some things we didn't cover in the chat because it was just so fast and furious. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. And thanks all.
Thank you all.
Yeah, so hopefully some of the chat things will come up again when the recording, but there was so many things and questions whizzing past, but they were helping each other as well.
The chat was really good. I was going to try to squeeze in a little analogy that I sometimes use, but you know, the difference between the portfolio tool set, not just necessarily platform, and the portfolio. I often refer to my laptop. So on my laptop, I've got wedding photographs and videos from my, you know, holidays, and I've got contract documentation and all sorts of stuff. And the only person that all makes sense to in its entirety is me. But certain bits of it, if I don't share it, like if I don't share, you know, a proposal for a tender somewhere, I just don't get the gig. So it's all created in one place, and it's got random thoughts and all sorts of stuff. And I think that's the difference between the portfolio kind of store all of my stuff and the bits I choose to share with selected audiences under terms often that I want to control. And there was another question I think as well, which was something around, yeah, really important. How do you get students to continue engage with their portfolio?
Yeah.
And I think again you need to separate the idea of portfolio thinking and the portfolio as an object, because if we can get students to always be planning and preparing for learning and then reflecting and making sense of it, it doesn't matter if that goes into a portfolio or not. It's the processes we're really interested in. And then for certain modules, you know, as you were saying, Paolo, things like experiments or placements or collaborative projects lend themselves really, really well to using, you know, portfolios as a tool for capturing that, sharing it with others, getting feedback, and also getting that feedback from day one if you need to, not waiting until you've finished the thing and handing it in. But because it's digital, sharing the link right at the beginning and getting an audience to give you feedback on it as it develops.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And I don't want to be crow here, but you know, when we went into lockdown in March, my module students already had the tools for their 100% ePortfolio assessed module. So I didn't have to go through that whole redefinition process that had to happen in lots of other modules because the essay, you know, timed essay situation wasn't going to happen. They already knew what they had to do. They had evidence. They were in that process. So, you know, if how much different would that pivot have looked if there had been wider, you know, more widespread adoption of ePortfolios? How much less stress would both students and staff have been under?
Yeah,
I've seen really nice ones as well. I think it was maybe Canada or America, where they just switched up their whole assessment to a photography portfolio of their lives during lockdown, whether it was to do with their learning or not. And there was, I saw the examples, and it was absolutely wonderful. It was their lives and their house, their spaces where they managed to carve some outside time. Really powerful stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds a brilliant idea, doesn't it? I